Great, 50 people logged in. Hi, everybody. We can't see you, but I'm so glad that you're here. My name is Sharon Goldsvick. I'm here with my wonderful colleague, Dov Kent. And this session is on winning messaging on anti-Semitism, a new message guide, and tools. And we're going to be sharing with you two new resources that we hope will help you as you are working on anti-Semitism, addressing anti-Semitism in your work in the progressive movement, whatever that means for you. So in just a moment, I think we'll start our presentation. We're going to present these two new tools to you. We're going to take you through a presentation. We'll stop a few times for questions, which I believe we can just see in the chat. So please put your questions in there. We also know, Dov and I have done these presentations a whole lot over the last year, and oftentimes people that show up have a lot of knowledge and wisdom and experience to share, so we really encourage you to do that in the chat as well. And we will try and answer as many questions as we can. So before I switch us over to presentation mode, I just want to hand it over to my co-presenter, Dov.
Hey y'all, I'm Dov Kent, and I am very pleased to be here with you today. I am in the role of the U.S. Director of Strategy and Outreach for the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism project, and we will talk more about what that is and what that means and how it and we can be helpful to you. So really glad to see you all and excited for this conversation together.
And Dov, where are you coming from today?
Oh, I am here in Durham, North Carolina, which is also Occaneechi territory.
And I am actually in Cambridge, England, which is where I live, although I'm from Raleigh, North Carolina, not that far from where Dov is right now. Okay, so I think we're ready. Can you take us, please, into our presentation? This is magical. Cool. Okay. So winning messaging on anti-Semitism, new message guides and tools. This is what we are going to be covering together today. And just to review for any folks who may have joined late, my name is Sharon Goldsvick. I'm the founder and CEO at Uprise. We're a consulting practice for good guys of all genders. We work with activists and advocates across the progressive world and do a lot of work very deeply rooted in progressive Jewish communities. And that's the context in which we've undertaken this work over the last year and a half or so to create new messaging to help move us forward on anti-Semitism. And we'll talk a little bit more about that soon.
Great. Thanks, Sharon. And again, I'm Dov Kent. I'm with the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism project. And I will be very excited to tell you more about what that resource can do for you. But let's just go ahead and dive in. So, why is this information important to progressives? Why are we here at Netroots Nation with this particular presentation for y'all? So a few core reasons. One is that the left has a history of misunderstanding and miscalculating anti-Semitism. And it's really limited our ability to grow effectively, and it's undermined our work against all oppressions. So we need to be, and we absolutely can be, the ones to change this story. Working to dismantle anti-Semitism is a key part of all of our work of building a multiracial movement where we can all thrive. So that's number one. Number two is that as political organizations, you might be supporting a campaign where anti-Semitism shows up, or what we'll talk about, smokescreen accusations of anti-Semitism are deployed. So even if you don't think your work relates to anti-Semitism or to Israel or Palestine, these smokescreen attacks can come at you. The right and the center have seen the effectiveness of these attacks on their opponents, and they can manufacture them in a whole host of ways. And then third, if we want to move progressive policies, domestic or international, progressives need to understand the political functioning of anti-Semitism and to be able to pivot from smokescreen attacks coming from our opponents. Any and all of our progressive priorities can be taken off the rails by anti-Semitism or by these smokescreen attacks that are undermining progressive leaders and progressive movements. as we have seen very recently, issues about Israel and Palestine also can suddenly become attached to everything from a domestic spending bill to an aid package to Lebanon. But if we understand how our opponents function, we can interrupt the pattern and we can stop this playbook from interrupting us. So, very exciting, lots of possibilities. All right. So we're going to spend now literally just 5 or 6 minutes talking about anti-Semitism. There's a lot of confusion about anti-Semitism, and we're not going to go through the entire history. So we're really just going to articulate the most important elements that progressives need to understand. So first, we're going to just start with a definition. And this is a definition from the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism, which is that anti-Semitism is discrimination, prejudice, hostility, or violence against Jews as Jews, or Jewish institutions as Jewish. And this is important because by defining anti-Semitism appropriately through the Jerusalem Declaration, we can start to counter the right and the center's playbook just from that point. Okay, so as the Jerusalem Declaration insists, and we'll go to the next slide. In order to understand anti-Semitism, we need to go back to what we know about all oppressions. So all oppressions tell a story about a people that dehumanizes them, sets them up for targeting or exploitation, and uses them to keep power in the hands of those who currently hold it. And each of these stories work together to reinforce each other and to keep us separated and exploited. So what is the story that anti-Semitism tells? Anti-Semitism tells the story that Jews are ultimately responsible for people's suffering. Anti-Semitism is, in essence, a conspiracy theory. So in Christian Europe, it was a story that blamed Jews for the death of Jesus, for the Black Plague, for unexplained deaths of children in small towns. And today, it's a conspiracy theory that says Jews control the banks, or the government, or the media, or all three, or whether or not the US goes to war, right? We've heard these. And so while anti-Black racism, as an example, is used by leaders in order to dehumanize Black people, to exploit them for their labor and resources, anti-Semitism is used to dehumanize Jews to create a scapegoat and obscure the exploitation of everyone under oppression. So the story says that Jews are out to undermine whatever society they're part of in order to gain power. And this is why Jews are often depicted as both arch-capitalists and arch-communists, often at the same time, right? So anti-Semitism is used to keep the wheels of inequality and oppression turning and hidden from view. It's a story that Jews are the man behind the curtain, controlling the levers of power, but really anti-Semitism is the curtain, okay? So now we're going to turn to talking about understanding the right and the center's playbook, what we're calling the mechanisms of smokescreen accusations of anti-Semitism. So this is how anti-Semitism is actually used politically very effectively in some cases. And I want to note here that the ideological foundations of this work I did with my colleagues at Ben Dark and Jews Against White Nationalism. Great groups. Okay, so first we're going to talk about the right. The right has employed a strategy of anti-Semitism over the last several years that uses a two-part approach that's contradictory on its face, but as we'll explain, the confusion is actually part of the strategy. So this first approach is their commonplace use of anti-Semitism in some of the traditional ways that the right and authoritarians have used it in other historical eras. To deflect blame for suffering, deflect blame for inequality, policy failures, onto Jewish people by using anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and dog whistles. So explicitly or implicitly through speeches, mailers, tweets, they're communicating that things are bad because there's a shadowy group of people manipulating your lives and making you suffer. And in the past, people would actually name the Jews. And today they might say globalists, or will reference names like Soros or Bloomberg or Bernie or Schumer. We've seen this, right? So the second approach is their use of smokescreen accusations of anti-Semitism against Democratic or other political opponents. And they most frequently target effective leaders of color who are newer to the national political scene, thereby exploiting racial prejudices to undermine their ability to lead. So here's, in essence, how this plays out. Next slide, please. The right wing uses commonplace anti-Semitism in their electoral messaging to deflect blame for people suffering and social and economic ills. This gives their base a distracting villain. Then these right-wing conspiracy theories incite anti-Semitic violence. The violence generates legitimate fear and anger within the American Jewish community. And the right then uses these smokescreen accusations of anti-Semitism to direct this fear and this anger against their political opponents. Democrats, progressive movements, people of color, anyone who threatens their political power. So a really painful example of this is that just days after the shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, the political right tried to push a bill through Congress against the boycott, investment, and sanction movement led by Palestinians. So that shooter had no connection whatsoever to the Palestinian rights movement. But people on the right tried to use the fear of anti-Semitism that had been generated by that attack to go after Palestinian leaders in the Palestinian movement. But it doesn't always have to follow a major event like that. By just pointing to real missteps or by manufacturing false controversies, they can attack progressive leaders, progressive movements, and their allies, all in the name of defending the Jews, and all the while using anti-Semitic tropes themselves that embolden a specific white nationalist subset of their base. And the thing is, they can frequently expect their accusations to be accepted at face value, in part due to the tendency of many people in our white supremacist society to consciously or subconsciously more readily believe negative stories about people of color. So the question is, why would they do this? It's kind of our work. What are some of their motivations? Well, this strategy that has allowed them to accomplish several things at once. Just a few are, it's allowed right-wing candidates to increase racialized fears among white voters while evading responsibility for making Jews less safe. And by pointing the finger at their political opponents, they have strained progressive, cross-religious, and cross-racial alliances that threaten right-wing power. They also have provided a way for conservative voters to view their party as defending a vulnerable group from bigotry, and are able to mollify conservative voters while shoring up support from white evangelical voters, which frankly is the audience for which a lot of this, a lot of their speeches and attacks are for. And they're also able to warp any criticism of Israeli policy. I'm gonna take a sip of water here. This stuff's amazing. So they're able to warp any criticism of Israeli policy as an attack on Jews and delegitimize Palestinian narratives and experiences. So regardless of how effective each individual tactic might be, it's likely that these strategies collectively have had a major impact on your work in some way, even if it's just what you have been able to prioritize. Okay, so if that wasn't enough, we got to talk about the center. So the center doesn't need to use the right's two-part strategy. They can utilize the groundwork that the right has laid and just use smokescreen accusations against their political opponents on the left. And by the center, we're referring here to what we could think of as status quo corporate groups, so conservatives in all parties. And for them, it's not a politics of grievances as the priority. It's more often about maintaining the political and the economic status quo. So they can use anti-Semitism to benefit their interests. And this group will often amplify these smokescreen accusations that are coming from the right and use them to weaken their progressive opponents in order to keep power and hold on to the status quo. So that's to say that the right makes it a kind of common sense that progressives who stand up for Palestinian humanity do so out of a lack of concern for or even antipathy towards Jewish safety. And then all the center has to do is allude to that common sense. So getting to some specifics here, let's name names. Groups like the Democratic Majority for Israel, DMFI, it's a new PAC that's staffed and funded by some old players. They're able to use existing ideas to wage their attacks against their progressive opponents. And they're able to effectively warp any criticism of Israeli policy as an attack on Jews, and warp any pro-Palestinian policy as being somehow inherently anti-Jewish, when what we know is that being pro-Jewish and pro-Palestinian are not only able to go together, they have to go together. Okay, so through this, the center has joined the right in undermining progressive opposition. There are often material consequences against those accused. For candidates or elected officials, it's anything from eroding support from their base, depressing turnout in elections, undermining the public's trust in them, distracting them and their teams from their priorities, or it can and often does result in threats of violence, including death threats. These centrist groups also try to scare candidates and politicians into anti-Palestinian political positions. The message that DMFI and others say is that you can't take a stand with Palestine or you'll lose your election. But the polls and the data say nothing of the sort. And if you want more of those polls and data, get in touch. They recently tried to make a test case out of the Ohio special election between Nina Turner and Chantel Brown. And while Brown did win, the claim that she won because of her Israel politics just isn't true. And one more kind of dive I'll do into that is that, first of all, DMFI's ads in the race didn't talk about Israel news at all. They know that Israel isn't actually an important voting issue because poll after poll of Jewish voters shows that to be the case. And so second, something they did quite well was support the on-the-ground organizing efforts in, the relationship building. And like the majority of elections, we know that it's not just a comms game, but a relationship building process, right? So DMFI and grassroots right-wing Jewish organizations did make their ground game about Israel in the Jewish parts of the district, but that did not make or break the election. All of the deep post-mortem analysis of the election from many sources show that there were many reasons the election went the way it did, from what the field efforts, where the money was spent. I'm not going to go into that, but really the vast majority of voters in that election did not vote on the basis of Israel at all. And like we see, every poll after poll shows that even for the Jewish community, 4 to 8% of people will vote on Israel. So there's a scare tactic that's coming from the center that says you can't support Palestinian rights or you will lose. And we are here to tell you that it's not true, but you will need some tools to help you along the way. So we want to turn now towards interventions. And Sharon, I will kick it to you.
All right. Thank you, Dev. So what do we do about this? What do we do about changing the conversation and about taking us to a place where we actually get to lead on this issue and where we change not only what we think about it, but how we feel about it? And I want to just ask you all, I don't know how many of you there are here, and I can't see your faces, but I want to just ask you all, wherever you are, just take a second and think about the last conversation you had about anti-Semitism. And think about how that conversation made you feel. And if you want to, share how that feeling hit you in the chat so that we can have a little bit of sharing here. I can tell you that some really common things that come up when I ask this question are frustration, scared, alone, sad, trapped, despairing, angry, right? That is actually purposeful. Those feelings are purposeful. That is the emotional response that our opposition, which Deb just laid out, that's what they're hoping will happen. They are hoping that we will feel all of those things. Because whether you are Jewish or not, and your emotional landscape may be different depending on whether that is part of your identity, that emotional response, getting us stuck in those negative emotions, is exactly the point of the existing conversation about anti-Semitism. So let's break that down a little bit. When we're thinking about what a good message has to do, it has to do a whole lot of things all at once. It has to make anti-Semitism a liability for the political right. It has to address those fears that Dov talked about, how those fears are created. It has to address that, right? People are scared. There are reasons that we are scared. It has to deflate and shield against anti-Semitic tropes, which, as we know from this two-part strategy, is part of what the right wing is doing. It's using those anti-Semitic tropes. It's using, commonplace anti-Semitism to create that situation of fear. It has to make togetherness the desirable strategy for Jewish people. And what I mean by that is, part of the function of anti-Semitism is to keep Jews isolated. And so a new way of approaching this conversation should aim to get rid of that idea, should aim to make it clear that the way that we solve anti-Semitism is actually through togetherness. It's not ever going to be through isolation or inward-facing kinds of strategies. It has to provide a way for all progressives and all people to see themselves in this fight. As Doug said early on, this is a part of all of our work for collective liberation. It has to include addressing anti-Semitism in it. And so for that to be effective, we have to see a way that all of us show up in this story, whether we're Jewish or not. You are a part of this story, and you should be, right? And finally, and very importantly, it has to create a framework to address mistakes and missteps, because they're going to happen. And we know that they're going to happen. And they have happened. And when they do, right, they shouldn't be a moment of breakage. They should be a moment of building, right? They can be hard and difficult, but they shouldn't break us. They shouldn't be successful at driving wedges in the way that the right is hoping that they are. And really good messaging on this issue will help us create a framework to address mistakes and missteps when they happen. So if that's not a tall enough order for me as a messaging expert and as a comms person, I don't know what is. But here's what we took into account in building this project. And I want to mention here that the wonderful organization Bend the Arc, Doug was working at Bend the Arc at the time. We got to collaborate on this project. Was really the driving organizational force behind this project, and we'll share more about that later on. But we took input from Bend the Arc organizers and a group of Jewish progressive organizations that are working on progressive social justice issues and on anti-Semitism, local groups all over the country, and a couple of national groups as well. So we took a look at, what are they working on? What are they saying about this issue? We looked at opposition messages. What are the other guys saying about this? We looked at just public messages about anti-Semitism in general from lots of different Jewish groups. We looked at the race-class narrative and used research insights from that process to inform this messaging, and research insights from other pieces of polling and message testing research that helped inform the messaging that we came up with. So in looking at all of these things, it became very clear that the problem we have with the conversation on anti-Semitism really comes back to the story that we are telling about anti-Semitism at a very, very basic level. And if we don't fix that story, we are not going to be able to persuade people that another way is possible. Think back for a second to all of those negative emotions that we just talked about. And you're going to see the origin of those negative emotions in this story. So this is the story of anti-Semitism. And we're saying here that this is the story that our opponents tell, but really, this is a story that a lot of us tell too. It's just kind of the common story about anti-Semitism. And it says that anti-Semitism is this timeless and static thing that's existed throughout time, and it's never really going to go away, right? Maybe it's a little better, maybe it's a little worse. Sometimes we describe it as cyclical, right? Like it's kind of always there. It's always going to be there, and it targets Jews as the root cause of all of society's problems. And it exists across the political spectrum, right? Doesn't matter whether it's from the left or from the right. It's just kind of everywhere, and there's no differentiation at all. Sometimes we describe it as a binary personal trait. And when I say that, what I mean is that a person is or is not an anti-Semite, that it's like a character trait of an individual. And we also sometimes describe it as a form of hatred, right? Very, very commonly describe anti-Semitism as a form of hatred. Now, the problem with this is that describing it as a hatred, people mostly understand that as an interpersonal issue. So if I can think of an individual Jewish person to whom I don't hold, personal animus, then I must not hate Jews, and therefore I am not an anti-Semite as a binary personal trait, and therefore this isn't a problem. It doesn't apply to me, right? Of course, that's not how this works. That's not how structural oppression works. But using that language reinforces those ideas and actually makes it harder to address this. So this is kind of the story, right? And what is the basic plot and character structure of this story, or the who, why, and how of this story, right? Well, the who is, anti-Semitism is kind of an agent unto itself, right? Like in this story, anti-Semitism can kind of exist absent any human actors. I asked people once to find examples of anti-Semitism as an agent in one of the trainings on this message platform that I did. And people went out and just I just said, look at a news article or opinion writing, and just see if you can find any examples of places where anti-Semitism is given agency unto itself. And so one person found an article that said, anti-Semitism has found a home in the Democratic Party. And another person found one that said, the job of anti-Semitism is something. And I was like, this is great. Anti-Semitism's got a home. It's got a job. Maybe it's got a cell phone plan. I don't know. But it's just out there in the world, fucking shit up, right? Don't need any people involved. It's just anti-Semitism, the big bad, monster going to its job from its home and doing its things, right? So it's very difficult for us to understand that we can solve a problem if we don't believe that we as human beings have caused a problem, right? It also gives cover to the people that we think are responsible for anti-Semitism when we refer to it as if it had agency unto itself, right? So in this story, all people are potential participants in this story, even though anti-Semitism has agency, right? And Jews are always the target. The why, well, this story doesn't really give us much in terms of the why, right? If anti-Semitism is an agent unto itself, then it doesn't need motivation. There's no purpose behind anything. So it just sort of exists because it exists. It's just there because it's there, right? And then sometimes, especially if we're using the hatred language, we might say, well, there are just some people who hate Jews. They hate Jews. They just hate us. It's irrational, and it's a hatred, and that's it. And while that's true, there are some people who just hate Jews irrationally. That's actually not a good explanation for anti-Semitism. And it doesn't reflect the reality of how anti-Semitism exists as a political force. And then the how, so what does that look like actually in the world, right? So it can look like spreading conspiracy theories, as Doug discussed before, blaming Jews for problems, and even things like violent acts, right? So this is sort of a very common story. It is the story that our opposition is telling purposefully, and it's also the story that we are participating in some ways, wittingly or unwittingly, when we use the language that exists about anti-Semitism. I want to talk about two really common metaphors that we found when we took a look at all of the language, that is out there in the world that people are using really commonly to talk about anti-Semitism. What we found is that there are two very, very common metaphors. I'm not going to go into a whole thing making the case for metaphor analysis. I hope that you all have some background in why this is an important thing. If not, please email me. I will be very happy to share some additional research and information about this. But what I want you to know is that metaphor evokes in our minds on a totally unconscious level understandings about problems and the solutions to those problems that relate to the metaphoric language. So they help us understand both like what the nature of a problem is and also to suggest what an appropriate solution to that problem would be. And the two most common metaphors that we see about anti-Semitism are a water metaphor and a virus metaphor. And let me just share a little bit of what those look like. So the water metaphor sounds like this. Anti-Semitism comes in waves, right? Or anti-Semitism in America ebbs and flows. Or we're now experiencing a wave of violent anti-Semitism. We must push back against the rising tide of anti-Semitism. This is my personal favorite. Yes, exactly. So this one, I mean, to me, this is so crazy, right? Because I just think about myself like standing on a beach and there's anti-Semitism about to come in and knock me over, and I'm just like raising my fist at it, right? Like, okay, that doesn't sound like that's really going to solve the problem. Sometimes, especially those of us who have a background in racial justice organizing, we'll say something like anti-Semitism is the water we swim in, right? That's also a use in this case of the water metaphor. So what does this suggest to us, right? Well, this really reinforces that story that we just broke down, right? It suggests that anti-Semitism is a part of nature, right? It's eternal. It can rise, it can fall, but it is always going to be there. And one of our colleagues actually pointed out as we were going through this presentation that not only is it a part of nature, water is essential for life. When we use the water metaphor, it's like we're saying we cannot imagine a world in which there is no water, and we cannot imagine surviving without it. That is such a scary thing to say about anti-Semitism and to suggest and to evoke in our minds when talking about this problem. No wonder we're scared, right? No wonder we're stuck in that negative emotional space. It's not created by people, right? And therefore it can't be stopped by people. We don't accept that we can stop a problem that we as humans didn't create, right? It is indiscriminate, right? Anybody can get caught up in a wave. Anybody can drown in water, right? It doesn't serve anybody's purposes, maybe incidentally. Maybe someone is better at surfing than someone else, but like that's kind of it, right? Like this is not a problem that we can solve. And let's look at the virus metaphor. So what does that look like in language? It looks like this person is a virulent anti-Semite, right? Or anti-Semitism has infected the world. Sometimes we say it has infected our body politic. That's a really common usage. This person is spreading anti-Semitism, right? Or anti-Semitism has different mutations. Right, left, radical Islam. Now, the reason I chose those examples is because last summer, not this past summer, but the year before, there was a PBS special about anti-Semitism. It was called Virus, and it described different mutations, and these were the mutations. And this is very, very common, very common usage as well. In fact, this is one of those things that, now that I have shown this to you, you kind of can't unsee it. And I promise you that as you are out in the world, like reading stuff about anti-Semitism or people are talking about anti-Semitism, you are going to see examples of the water metaphor and the virus metaphor all over the place. It's impossible to avoid. They're very, 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 very common. So what does this virus metaphor suggest to us? That it's natural, it's not created by people. I know we have now like kind of this idea about lab-created viruses, but that's not really something that people, that's evoked in people's minds when you use this metaphoric language for the purposes of, this metaphor analysis. It is still suggesting that this is a natural problem. It just, sprung up in the earth and it was not created by people at all, right? The solution to that problem is universal vaccination or medication, right? We can sort of think about whether that aligns with what we think the solution to anti-Semitism might be. Again, it's indiscriminate, right? So anybody can be infected, anybody can spread it. The source doesn't matter, right? The anti-Semitism that I catch from one person is going to be exactly the same as the anti-Semitism that I catch from another person, right? So it doesn't matter. And this really reinforces this idea that it's a binary personal trait, right? So a person is infected or they're not. It's about what's inside of them or inside their heart, right? And again, it doesn't serve anybody's political purposes. Now, I know this is a weird thing to say in the time of very, very politicized COVID. But, again, from a very sort of basic metaphor analysis level, from, in terms of what this is evoking in our minds as we hear this language, when we hear this person is a virulent anti-Semite, right? What it's evoking for us is all of these things. Again, not a problem created by people. We don't really believe that people can solve it. And it is, again, like indiscriminate. Anybody can fall prey to it, right? So none of these things are really supporting what we believe to be true about this issue, or advancing a conversation with progressive values underlying it, and with our progressive analysis that says that the solution to this problem is addressing anti-Semitism in the context of collective liberation, not as like a separate and unique oppression that is totally disconnected from all other forms, right? So we've made a new metaphor, and we really want to invite you all to use this. And to use it instead of the unhelpful virus and water metaphors. And that looks like this. We call this the machinery metaphor. And it says that anti-Semitism is part of the machinery of division and fear created and used for specific political or material gain. And what does this get us? What does this machinery metaphor get us, right? So as opposed to our unhelpful virus and water metaphors, it suggests that this is something that was built by people, it is used by people for a specific purpose. Anybody can fuel a machine, right? But we don't all have the same relationship to a machine necessarily, right? Like we could fuel it, so we might even fuel it unintentionally, right? Like that's a thing that could happen. But it's the people who built it and who operate it who are responsible for it, and who are the ones who are benefiting from it, right? So now we have another way of talking about this, that it is something that is used for purpose, for gain, right? And that there are some people who are benefiting from it and some people who are not, and even people who are being harmed by it, right? We can absolutely imagine that there is no reason that any particular piece of machinery needs to exist in the world. So we can totally, as humans, stop it, shut it down, dismantle it, throw a wrench in it, right? Many, many ways to talk about that. And it's a part of a larger whole, right? It is part of the machinery of division and fear. So it is connected to other struggles. We're providing here a clear way for everyone to see themselves in this story. And, a connected array of machinery, not each of those machines does exactly the same thing or performs the same function, right, or works the same way, but we can see that they are connected to each other, and certainly that they are connected at least in the sense of the people who are operating them for purpose and for benefit. So we have from this metaphor a new story that we're telling about anti-Semitism, a new who, why, and how. And that says the who now, we have a different who, right? A different character that is responsible for anti-Semitism, and that is all of those who derive their power from division and fear. We still have Jewish people as the targets, right? But there are also other groups that are targeted by that array of connected machinery. And that's an important part of this story as well. The why, well, it's not just a because, right? We have a why, because those people who are operating that machinery, they gain political or material power when we are divided against each other. And how? What does that look like? Manufacturing fear, blaming Jews for problems, violent acts, and also targeting other groups of people on the basis of our race or our religion or other aspects of our identity. We can understand that that is actually part of a shared story. And there's another group of people that we would be remiss not to mention here, and that do exist in this new story that we are telling about anti-Semitism. And that's others in society who don't derive their power from division and fear, right? So they have been subject to the agent's deliberate attempt to divide, but they don't benefit from that division. They may even be directly harmed by it, right? So those people might, for example, fuel the machinery of division and fear by repeating an anti-Semitic trope, but there's a clear differentiation between people who fall into that category and people who are using anti-Semitism for a particular gain, for benefit. So how does this show up in language? How do we change our language then to adapt from these ways of talking that we're very used to in the virus and the water framing and move into this more helpful machinery metaphor framing? So right now, something that we might say is, no party is free of anti-Semitism, but it's really the Republicans, it's really the right wing that is actually, to blame for anti-Semitism. So instead of saying that, we can say, politicians who rely on division and fear for their power use anti-Semitism, right? So it's no longer the subject, it's no longer the agent, it's now the object. Instead of saying this person is an anti-Semite, again in our sort of binary personal trait framing, we might say this person is using anti-Semitism to generate fear and divide us against each other, right? Attaching purpose to it. This is not about irrational fear and hatred, this is about a purpose. And instead of saying this person said something anti-Semitic, but, right, this is like oftentimes how we try and address mistakes and missteps. Well, they said something anti-Semitic, but, right? So instead of saying that, we might now say what this person said could fuel anti-Semitism. So, right? So we have a way out of this. We don't have to be stuck in this place. All right, so that's the highest level piece of this new message, the machinery metaphor. But I want to show how we built this out into messaging language that is broader than just that, and that can be used, and again, really encourage you to use, that you do not need to credit us, you do not need to ask for permission. We really, really would love for you to use this freely in whatever way that it is useful to you. And before I share the whole message with you, I just want to give a couple of notes on language. So in this platform, you will see that we don't use the words, the terms white nationalists or white supremacists. Primarily, that is to avoid confusion, because you may be communicating to audiences who don't have a shared understanding of who those people are. We also want to make it as broad as possible so that we can attach blame to the right group of people that, the folks that we are talking to. So instead of saying white nationalists or white supremacists, we have said people who seek to create a country that's only for themselves. You might say people who seek to create a country that's only for themselves and people like them. This is just a plain English way of saying it. You can use white nationalists and white supremacists. Just be sure that your audience knows what you're talking about when you're saying that. We've provided this as an option for, to help you avoid confusion if you are concerned that your audience doesn't know what that means. This is maybe the most controversial messaging piece of advice that I'm going to give. It has become very, very common for many of us on the left to use this phrase, weaponization of anti-Semitism. And when we say weaponization of anti-Semitism, most of us, I would guess, on this call understand that to mean the strategy that Deb laid out for you earlier, right? Where like the right uses not real or, overinflated accusations of anti-Semitism against progressives in particular, progressives of color in particular, progressive women of color, to try and take them down, right? Now, the problem with calling that instance of anti-Semitism weaponization is twofold. The first problem with it is that audiences have no idea what that means. Like, many of us have developed a shared understanding of what that means, but when you use that, if you say that to a reporter and you're expecting people that are reading a newspaper to understand what that means, you're confusing a lot of your audience. People don't understand what weaponization of anti-Semitism is, and I don't think any of us are sufficiently interested in that becoming a thing to try and, make that a term that people understand on its face. But there's a bigger and maybe even more important reason why I'm suggesting that we not use this term anymore at all. and why many progressives, and particularly progressive Jews, have moved away from using that phrasing, which is that it kind of implies that the rest of anti-Semitism isn't a weapon, and it isn't dangerous or deadly. And of course it is. We all believe that it is, right? So it kind of sounds like when you say weaponization of anti-Semitism, it kind of sounds like you're downplaying the idea that anti-Semitism is dangerous on its face, which it is, right? So instead of saying that, we want to suggest you say pointing the finger at progressives for anti-Semitism, generating more division and fear by blaming Black and brown people for anti-Semitism. We're also playing around with this new phrase called smokescreen attacks or smokescreen anti-Semitism, which we think is a little bit more evocative of what's actually going on, both to generate confusion, obfuscate actions of the right, deflect responsibility for the things that they've done, create a condition of fear and confusion that's beneficial, right? So we like that phrase a little bit more, but again, you can use even more plain language to talk about this. Pointing the finger at progressives for anti-Semitism is a really good and simple way that works in most situations, right? We're also using, this is an insight that came from the race class narrative, but that's particularly important here, and I want to highlight. Sometimes we have a tendency to frame Jewish communities and communities of color or other identity groups as being entirely separate. And it's really important to underscore that the Jewish community is a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multilingual, multinational community that goes across lots and lots of different identity lines. And so it's really important to avoid framing that says Jews should join together with allies or Jews should join together with communities of color, because there are many, many Jews of color who sit in both communities at once and who are erased by language like that. So instead, we're suggesting to say something like join together across racial difference, join together across racial and religious difference, whatever the case may be, for your use. But very important to bring that up. And I also just think in general, it's important to be careful when we say allies. Like, again, in this virtual space, if we say allies, maybe we have a shared understanding of what that means. But many of us don't, many of your audiences don't. So important to keep that in mind as well. We are also following, again, from insights from the race class narrative research, a specific format for this message platform. So it starts with a shared value. It then explains the problem and identifies the people responsible for that problem. And finally, it shows our solution and what our vision for the future looks like. So I'm going to put this up here. I'm also going to read it through so we can all sort of take it in together. And I want you to know that you don't need to screenshot this or copy it down. If you would like a copy of this message platform, we will share it with you. And we'll tell you how to get your hands on it after this. So, but I'm just going to read this through for us. So this is what it sounds like. Most of us believe that every person, no matter our religion, where we come from, or what we look like, deserves to live with freedom, safety, and belonging. I'm going to read the parts of this that are in brackets, which are intended to come from a Jewish speaker. But if you are not a Jewish speaker, then just omit the words that are in the brackets. As Jews, we know that whether we're walking down the streets of our neighborhoods or through the doors of our holy spaces, freedom and safety for any of us depends on the freedom and safety of all of us. But there are some politicians who seek to build a country that's only for themselves and people like them, dividing us against each other and making us afraid while they hoard power and wealth. As Jews, we know how dangerous this is. When politicians target Jewish people and blame us for hard times, it leads directly to violence against us. Anti-Semitism is part of the machinery of division and fear those politicians rely on for power. The same machinery those politicians use to blame Black and brown people, people who are immigrants, people who are Muslim, and more. But whether they manufacture division and fear based on our religion, our skin color, or how long we've been here, their goal is to keep us from working together to win the things we all need to thrive. When Jewish people join together with our neighbors across difference, as we have in the past, we can shut down the fear factory and protect each other. We'll show up for each other every time one of us is targeted because of our differences and reject any politician who uses fear to divide us against each other. Together, we can build a country that fulfills the promise of freedom and safety for all of us, no exceptions. So I just want to say that we've already been, working with this messaging over the last year or so, a little bit over a year at this point, and we've seen some really incredible things that can happen when we start talking about anti-Semitism in a new way. I'm just bringing one example here of an interview where, we have a progressive elected official using this messaging in an interview, and we've seen many progressives start to use this. Not only politicians, but activist groups and leaders starting to work with this messaging to get us out of a place in which anti-Semitism is seen as a completely separate, unique, struggle that spans across every party, and there's no difference between the anti-Semitism on the left and the right, and all of these things that we kind of hear, and people are really using it to help get out of that space that we have been stuck in. So if you want to get the guide, it is available as a PDF and as a Google Doc. And you can email us for your copy. We cannot, I don't think, I'm just looking in the chat, and I don't think that is possible for us to.
We're not able to put things in the chat, but we can work with organizers to send it out. And we'll also have the links on the final slide.
Yes, exactly. So, email us for a copy if you would like it. hello@upriseforgood.com, and we will send you PDF and a link to the Google Doc. And it lays out everything that we've talked about today, and also, lots of other analysis that we did not have time to get to altogether. And of course, has the messaging, which you are very, very welcome and encouraged to use.
Okay, thank you so much, Sharon. Beautiful. Y'all should definitely get this messaging platform. And finally, just the other tool that we want you to have for all of this is the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism. And while we can't put it in the chat, you can go to the link on the screen to check it out. So let me just go back very briefly a few years to explain where this came from. So since 2016, the right and the center have wielded a definition of anti-Semitism that is promoted by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the IHRA, to thwart legitimate criticism of Israeli policy and U.S. support for Israel by claiming that such criticism is inherently anti-Semitic. So a shorthand for that definition is called the IHRA. So the IHRA, by muddying the waters over what is and isn't anti-Semitism, it's really been used exclusively to stop criticism of Israel and has done nothing to stop real anti-Semitic attacks basically coming at our community globally. It has done everything so our opponents can silence Palestinian voices and the movement for Palestinian rights. So in early 2020, an international group of renowned scholars who specialize, like they've spent their lives studying Jewish studies, anti-Semitism studies, Holocaust studies, Middle Eastern studies, began working on an alternative definition to counter the IHRA. And at the beginning of this year, they released the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism, which has since received the endorsement of hundreds of scholars around the world. So the JDA, as we call it for short, was created to situate the fight against anti-Semitism in the fight against all forms of racial, ethnic, cultural, religious, and gender oppression. Because as we've seen, our opponents try to say that anti-Semitism is distinct and separate from all other kinds of oppression, and so it can't possibly be responded to in the intersectional ways that protect all communities. But we know that while anti-Semitism has distinct features, all oppressions have distinct features, and they are interconnected. So we're not going to effectively dismantle anti-Semitism separate from the work that we're all in to dismantle racism and other oppressions. And also, because one of the impacts of anti-Semitism, as Sharon noted, is that it isolates Jews, any further attempt to isolate Jews is not going to work in that broader fight against anti-Semitism. Also, really importantly, the JDA ensures that there is full space for Palestinians to speak about their lived experience, and for them and others to express legitimate critiques of Israel, Zionism, of Israeli policy, something that we as progressives need to push for. And so the JDA can be used as an alternative to the IHRA definition. It can be used as a grounded defense against these smokescreen accusations of anti-Semitism coming from our opponents. And it can be used as an engagement tool. It can be used as a political education tool. And it's also just not a document. It is alive. There are people behind it. We have a speakers bureau of renowned scholars where authors or signers of the JDA can be called on for webinars, institutional meetings, op-ed writing, wherever having institutionally strong voices would support your work. So those are the tools that we want to have for you. We have just a minute left for questions, and I was noticing some of the conversation in the chat. So I'm actually, Sharon, if it's cool with you, I'm just going to jump into some of that.
Yeah.
And, you know, there's been like really huge conversations opened in the chat that we couldn't possibly complete in a few minutes. But one thing that I want to invite people into is there's a conversation about whiteness and Jewishness that's happening, right? And so one thing that I think is really important for us to recognize is that, one, is that whiteness and Jewishness evolved on two very different tracks. So Jewishness, Judaism, was around before most of our modern, sorry, I'm very distracted. Now the screen is just me, so I'm going to turn it off. Okay. When our modern ways of compartmentalizing people was not yet established. So is it a religion? Is it a people? Is it a culture? Is it a race? Is it an ethnicity? You know, all these questions. People were not, we did not have quite the language to divide peoples into such categories. So like lots of peoples who have been around for a very long time, Jews are not distinct in this, there's many, many peoples, trying to categorize Jewishness into one of these very specific categories may not be easy to do because it was not developed for those purposes. So that's one piece. Whiteness, as we know, is something that was developed for very clear political purposes, with, you know, obviously going back to imperialism, colonialism, and then in more modern times, as y'all are surely aware of, the scientific racism, right, that started to actually connect the specific physicality and you know, visual cues of people to extreme levels of power and oppression in our world. And so taking those two trajectories and connecting them and making complete sense of them in today's political context is very challenging. And I just want to note that. So this question of are European descended Jews white? Because we know that, you know, the question of are Jews are white? Well, no, we know that, you know, at least 20% of the Jewish community is people of color and probably more than that. And that's just in the US. So worldwide is different. So the question of are Jews white? No. Has whiteness and Jewishness been conflated in various ways for political purposes? Yes, we know that's to be true, right? Have Jewish people taken on a racialized identity in different parts of the world at different times for, you know, for the impacts of those in power to make certain rules, laws, delegations, designations? Yes. Have Jews of European descent been considered white? Yes. Have Jews of European descent been racialized and murdered because of their status as not white? Yes. So there is a lot of complexity in this question, and that's just to say that we want to be sure that when we're talking about Jewishness and whiteness, we're actually being really clear about what we're talking about in this moment and in this time. Because the changes throughout history and throughout places in the world have been so immense that there's not kind of just one way to summarize that. And that's this, I don't want to quiet that conversation. This is a conversation we need to talk about, because there's lots of ways in which whiteness and Jewishness has been used in ways that are deeply anti-Semitic, and that are deeply racist, and that are deeply anti-Palestinian. There's lots of work for us to do there, but let's do it together from a place where we know that it is informed by our assessment of political and material conditions today.
That was an incredible Jewishness and whiteness on one foot, Deb. I am really unbelievably impressed, and really, this is a whole topic that Deb does do trainings on and spends many hours talking only about. So really appreciate that summary. I want to address very quickly two things that I saw come up in the chat. The first is somebody asked about whether we've poll tested these messages, and the answer is that we have not yet. I don't have results to share with you that are from quantitative testing. I can tell you that they've been very extensively field tested, including in the context of the election. And we have seen some really good success using them from organizers all over the country who have used this messaging in lots of different kinds of media and lots of different campaign real world contexts. The other thing I want to say, relating back to Israel and hopefully maybe, bringing us back to as we wrap up our conversation today, is that if the only time that you are talking about anti-Semitism is in conversations about Israel and Palestine, or if the only time that you are talking about anti-Semitism is when you are trying to figure out how to deal with a right-wing accusation, this is a problem. And this means that we are not going to be successful in winning this issue. And so we hope that this new language helps you be able to take on this issue proactively wherever you are, in whatever part of your work it comes up, to include Jews in your story of us, in your organizing work, and to make this a strength for the progressive movement instead of a liability. So thank you so much. I don't know if Dove has disappeared, but she's not next to me anymore. So I will just accept Dove's I will express Dove's also gratitude for being here, my gratitude for getting to be here alongside her and with all of you. And there she is, she's back. I'm just wrapping us up, Dove. Thank you so much for being my co-panelist. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Again, if you need more info, hello@upriseforgood.com. And Dove?
I'm at Dove, D-O-V-E, at jda-usa.org.
So much, everybody. Enjoy the rest of Netroots.
Thanks, y'all.